One of the most famous legacies of the Second World War and the Holocaust was the fate of Anne Frank. Her posthumously published diary, entitled The Diary of a Young Girl, today has been translated into over 70 languages and has sold millions of copies. It offers us an insight into the life of Anne's family living inside the Nazi-occupied Netherlands, and at the time offers glimmers of hope and normality when the situation surrounding the Franks is incredibly desperate. Her diary ends poignantly on the final entry written on Tuesday the 1st of August 1944, after having documented her life hiding from the Nazis between 1942 and 1944. It is after this that Anne's story comes to an end within around 6 months, following her arrest and deportation to concentration camps. Today we look at the final days and the tragic death of Anne Frank, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. For the first 5 years of Anne's life, she lived with her parents and her older sister Margot in an apartment in Frankfurt. However, being Jewish when Hitler seized power in 1933, Otto Frank fled to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, linking up with business connections. After this, the rest of the family followed, and Anne arrived in February 1934. Within Amsterdam there were other Jewish families living there, and things looked bleak for them when the Germans began to occupy the city in summer 1940. By July 1942, the German authorities and the Dutch who worked with them began to round up Jews across the Netherlands at a transit camp or a holding facility known as Westerbork. This was a place where Jewish people would be held before being transported to a main concentration camp. Many were transferred to Auschwitz and Sobibor, huge death camps and extermination facilities found within Poland. Anne and her family would find sanctuary and protection hiding in an apartment in a secret attic that would provide them with some degree of safety from the Nazis. The Frank family would later be joined by 4 Dutch Jews also, and they would live there for 2 years inside the secret attic apartment behind the office of the family-owned business at 263 Prinsengracht Street. The Franks were helped by a number of Otto Frank, Anne's father's colleagues and business associates, and these helpers would prepare the hiding place and also smuggle food, clothes and supplies to the Franks. This was incredibly risky, as if they were caught, they could possibly pay with their lives and be transported to the death camps as well. Anne would spend 761 days inside the secret annex, and it was incredibly risky. There were certain dangers throughout each day. For example, it was important that no noise from the hiders was made, as the warehouse found below the hiding place was still functioning. The hiders had to be quiet and walk around in socks to make less noise. After the warehouse workers had gone home, the hiders were allowed to spread out throughout the building and were no longer restricted to the secret annex. It was within this setting where Anne wrote much of her diary. There was a huge need for complete secrecy surrounding the annex, not just for the Franks, but also for the safety of the helpers. There was much hope for Anne and her sister Margot, and they both wished to return to school once their ordeal was over, and believed they would go on to possibly live a normal life following the war. Anne wished to become a journalist and continued completing studies whilst being inside the attic. Anne would continue to write her diary until the 1st of August 1944, where the last entry was recorded. On the morning of the 4th of August 1944, the Gestapo, the German secret state police, would somehow discover the hiding place in the secret annex. The Franks and the rest of the people hiding inside were taken to the police headquarters and interrogated and held overnight. The common belief was that the Franks were betrayed by someone, or that the Gestapo were tipped off by an anonymous Dutch caller. However, there was also a thought that the Gestapo discovered the hiding place by accident, whilst conducting an investigation about illegal work and fraud involving ration coupons which was occurring at the warehouse and the house. Together with 2 of the helpers, those hiding inside the annex were taken to a Gestapo prison and were interrogated to find out if they knew about any more people hiding out. Anne's father Otto said that they had lost all contact with friends and acquaintances during their 25 months in hiding. After the investigation, those from the secret annex and the helpers were separated. The helpers Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler were taken to a detention centre, and the 8 from the annex were taken also to another detention centre. This prison was incredibly overcrowded, and 2 days later they were transported to the Westerbork transit camp. Westerbork had already seen over 100,000 Jews pass through its gates for processing before they were sent to concentration camps. The Franks, for hiding, were considered criminals and were sent to the punishment barracks for a period of hard labour and gruelling work. The Franks were kept here for over a month, and in early September 1944 they were transported by train from Westerbork in the Netherlands to Auschwitz-Birkenau in occupied Poland. The Franks and the others in the group who hid at the annex arrived following a 3-day journey. Along with 1,011 other Jews, they were packed in horrendous conditions inside tightly closed packed goods carriages. They would arrive at Auschwitz in the night and were forced off the train and told to leave their luggage behind. The men and women were split up, and it would be the last time that Otto Frank, Ann's father, would see his wife and his daughters. Whilst off the train, the Nazis would assess which prisoners were fit for work, and the people from the annex were deemed fit. However, hundreds of the other passengers from the train were not, and they were taken straight to the gas chambers. Those from the annex were then sent to the sauna, and a number was tattooed on their arm, and they were forced to shower and dress in the camp uniform. Ann was tattooed with a number between A25060 and A25271, with her identity now becoming just a number. Ann, along with her sister and mother, were forced into labour and were chosen to work and stayed in Auschwitz-Birkenau, whilst her father and the other male hiders had to walk to Auschwitz I, 3 kilometres away, and were forced also to do hard labour. All of the women from the annex had survived their initial selection and ended up inside part of the camp designated for slave labour. At the time, the German war industry was facing a huge labour shortage, and prisoners were used to help solve this problem. Ann would stay at Birkenau for 2 months with her mum and sister, and she would have suffered like dozens of thousands inside the camps. She would have been forced to have had her head shaved, forced to stand for hours at roll call, forced to complete gruelling work, and would have also seen the barbarism of the camp's guards. The fear of disease would have been huge, with the worry that any signs of illness could result in someone being sent straight to the gas chamber and their deaths. Witnesses say that Ann became withdrawn at this time and often was seen tearful and upset when she saw children being led to the gas chambers, and others would note of her strength and courage. Disease across the camp was rampant, and Ann began to develop scabies, and the Frank sisters were moved to the camp infirmary, which itself was in a horrific condition, being infested with rats. On the 26th of October 1944, a large amount of women were selected to go and work at other locations, but Ann, Margot and Edith, her mother, were not selected. 4 days later, another selection took place, and it was noted how the Frank women were forced to stand naked on the parade ground, and along with 1,000 other women, were put then on a transport. The camp doctor selected Ann and Margot for transport, but not their mother. Edith was forced to stay behind, and the mother and daughters were separated for the first time. Ann and Margot were locked in barracks and then forced into cattle wagons. All they were given was a small portion of bread, a piece of sausage or cheese, a small amount of margarine, and a barrel of drinking water per wagon to keep them alive. Ann would have been locked in with 70 other women for her journey, with her destination being unknown. 2 days later, their train would arrive at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, which was in northern Germany. Prisoners of war and Jews had been imprisoned here, and the women were put into tents, but a few days after arriving, the tents were damaged by a storm, and then Ann and Margot were kept in barracks with hardly any space. They had been forced to walk around 8 kilometres, and upon their arrival were given a piece of cloth with their new camp number to be worn on all of their clothes. The destruction caused by the storm was horrific, and the camp conditions became even worse. August van Pels, another hider, had accompanied Ann and Margot at this time, but the state of Bergen-Belsen was like hell on earth. Disease was rife across the camp, and Ann was described at the time as being bald, emaciated and shivering, clearly suffering from the awful treatment. Whilst inside Belsen, Ann ran into children she had known in Amsterdam, but during the winter of 1944 to 1945, there was a huge food shortage in Belsen, and the camp was disgusting and crawling with rats and other vermin. A former classmate of Ann's stated how she was no more than a skeleton by then. She was wrapped in a blanket, she couldn't bear to wear her clothes anymore because they were crawling with lice. Ann would tell acquaintances that she believed her parents were dead, and for this she did not want to live much longer. Margot, her sister, had become so ill that she was incredibly weak. In early 1945, the typhus epidemic spread throughout Bergen-Belsen, and it killed 17,000 prisoners inside the camp. Other diseases were prominent, such as typhoid fever, and because of these conditions within the camp, it isn't really clear how Anne died. It's mostly assumed that she succumbed to the epidemic that was spreading throughout the camp. A survivor who knew Anne would say how her bed was around the corner from me, she was delirious, terrible and burning up, pointing towards a fever. Rations had been cut at the camp, and although there were no gas chambers at Belsen, around 1,000 people a day were dying before it was liberated, and the crematorium could not handle the sheer number of bodies, and because of this the corpses laid around the camp. Witnesses would later say how Margot Frank would fall from her bunk and was killed by the shock, and other accounts say how she succumbed to the epidemic. It would be a day after Margot's death in which Anne would pass away as well. The exact dates of the Frank sisters' death was not recorded, and it's thought that they could have died as early as February 1945 or as late as a few weeks before the British liberated the camp on the 15th of April 1945. Witnesses stated how the Franks displayed symptoms of typhus by early February, and most untreated victims of the disease died within 12 days of their first symptoms. The Red Cross would conclude that Anne would pass away from typhus in March 1945, and the Dutch authorities later set the official date of death for both Anne and Margot as the 31st of March 1945. Anne Frank's legacy and impact on the world following the Second World War would be inspirational, and she lives on through her writing and her diary, which was published by her father, the only one of the Franks who would survive the concentration camps. Within her words are moments of beauty, which remind us that even in the depths of hell and horror, beauty can be found if you look hard enough. Anne wrote, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world, and also, what is done cannot be undone, but one can prevent it happening again." It's with this that stories such as Anne Frank's are an incredibly important learning curve for the present, but also for the future generations.